Yes, so I'd also like to welcome everyone to this debate tonight and just give my sincere thanks to both of the debate participants and the student organizations who have brought this together, and just say thank you for asking me to moderate, because I think that this is a really important conversation, and that I'm very glad that there's such a cordial and friendly atmosphere here, because I think that shows that this is in the right spirit. So to get us started off, I think that there were individuals from the different student organizations who wanted to say a word about what it is that they do from Light and Truth. First of all, is there someone? Yeah, please.
My name is Blake. I am the president of Light and Truth Campus Ministries here at IU Kokomo. And what we do is we are an organization. We get together. We do weekly Bible studies Tuesdays at 1 o'clock in KC 114. We also just get together in fellowship with people here on campus. We just build relationships here on campus, just getting to know our fellow students. We do this by hosting some dance parties. Ultimate Frisbee comes up throughout the year, coming up in the next couple of weeks when it gets warmer on Thursday nights. So we just want to get to know people here on campus and share our beliefs with each one of you guys and get to know you guys. But it is my honor tonight to introduce Pastor Chad Damitz from Bible Baptist Church here in Kokomo. Pastor Chad's passion is to lead and grow our ministry to college-age students here at IU Kokomo and Ivy Tech. He received his Master's of Divinity degree at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he's previously worked as an assistant pastor of discipleship in Prospect, Kentucky, before coming here to Kokomo to Bible Baptist. In 2013, he joined Bible Baptist in 2013. Chad and his wife, Oya, both graduated from Southern Seminary and married in 2011. They enjoy traveling to see their family in Ukraine, visiting parks, and spending quality time with their son, Evan. 3 interesting facts about Chad is he grew up on the baseball field in his backyard. He swam in college, and his favorite flavor of ice cream is butter pecan. So everyone give a warm welcome to Chad Damitz.
And from the Secular Student Alliance.
Hello, my name is Michael Terrell. I'm the president of the Secular Student Alliance here at IUK, which started in fall of 2013. We're a group of non-believers, generally people who don't believe in God or don't know if God exists or gods exist. And we come together and sort of talk about that and create a safe space for people that don't believe, because you think about it, you have, the religious have their churches, they have, those sort of safe spaces that they go to worship, and non-believers don't really have that. So we create a space on campus for students to come and talk every other Wednesday at 1:30. So if you're interested in talking with us, come up to our table over there after the debate, and we'll be glad to talk to you. You can join our Facebook page at facebook.com/SSAIUK. And then we can put you on our email list if you come up and give your email to us. But I have the privilege of introducing my great friend, Justin Clark. Justin Clark is a graduate of Indiana University Kokomo, earning a Bachelor of Science in History and Political Science with a minor in philosophy in 2014. He is currently pursuing a master's degree in public history and a graduate certificate in museum studies. An avid reader, Justin loves studying American history, political theory, and philosophy, and his favorite book is Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln by Doris Kearns Goodwin. He has been with his fiancée, Kaylee Davis, for over 8 years and is quite proud of their high school sweetheart status. One fun fact about Justin is that he is left-handed, a trait he shares with both Barack Obama and John McCain. If you remember their debates in 2008, you'll see that Justin will write just as awkwardly in this debate as they did in theirs. Thank you.
as the moderator, I'm here to make you aware of kind of the structure and the ground rules for this event. I think that though I can clearly see that there's some strong opinions on various sides and support for various sides, I would ask that people hold any kind of applause or enthusiasm until after the entire event is over, so that each person has the kind of a fair shot at making their case and presenting information fairly. So I thank you for that. We began before the event started with a coin toss to see who would get to speak first, and I awkwardly tossed a coin because I'm not an athlete, and dropped it on the table. And Chad had called heads, and it was heads, and so he had the privilege of choosing whether to speak first or second, and so he has chosen to speak first. And so to open the formal debate process, he'll have 15 minutes to make his opening statement. I'll be keeping time. I'll kind of nudge him when he has about a minute left.
I'll be over here.
Oh, I will signal to him. Yeah. Just go gadget arm. And in order to make him aware that he'll have about a minute left, and then there will be a 15-minute statement from Justin, and we'll go back and forth. Okay, so that's how we're going to do this. So thank you very much to both debaters, and best of luck, and look forward to the question portion after this formal portion.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So good evening. Well, first, I want to thank the student groups for organizing this debate. And I also want to thank Dr. Christina Downey for her willingness to come in and be our moderator. So if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here today. I also want to thank Justin Clark for agreeing to tonight's debate. Now, we may disagree on the topic at hand, but he has been a pleasant person to work with. We've been organizing this together, and so I am commending him for that. Now, in tonight's debate, I want to first establish 4 beliefs regarding morality that I think Justin and I agree upon, some common ground. 1, you do not have to believe in God to perform moral actions. Both religious and non-religious are able to do charitable donations to a place like United Way. 2, you do not have to believe in God to know morality. We call that in philosophy epistemology. You can know about morality because I would say that it's embedded in your conscience and your faculties by God. 3, you can believe in God and do bad things and even do them in the name of religion. Spanish Inquisition, right? Medieval empire during that time, ISIS today. 4th, the definition of morality. I think Justin and I might have slightly different wording, but I think we would agree that morality deals with the intentions, the attitudes, and the beliefs and actions between those that are good and moral and those that are bad and immoral. So since Justin and I have common ground with these beliefs, I find it now more productive to focus our attention on the main point at hand. Is God the basis, the origin, or the ontological basis for morality? Here is my main argument. It is more rational to believe that morals originated from an intrinsically valuable, intelligent creator, commonly known as God, than for morals to have emerged evolutionarily through a valueless, non-intelligent, cause and effect physical process. To defend this argument, I suggest 3 criteria in which every valid moral system should inquire. First, any sufficient moral system should have an objective standard of what is right and what is wrong. Second, any sufficient moral system should explain the connection between free will and human responsibility. Third, any sufficient moral system should present justification for human value. Okay? Now let's now focus on the first criteria at hand. Any sufficient moral system must have an objective standard of what is right and wrong. To say that morality is objective is to say that the idea of right and wrong are universally fixed, regardless of place, time, and culture. So it's regardless of human opinion. We call that in ethics subjectivism. I'm talking about an objectivity. So saying murdering an innocent person is wrong is just as objectively true as 2 + 2 = 4, or the speed of light travels at 186,000 miles per second. So even if someone believed that 2 + 2 equaled something other than 4, or that murdering an innocent person is justifiable, their opinion would still be objectively wrong. My grandmother-in-law, she lived during the diabolical reign of Joseph Stalin. Between the years of 1937 and 1938, commonly known as the Great Purge, Stalin authorized the execution of over 40,000 innocent lives, 90% of which were systematically shot to death. The historian Dmitri, in his book, Stalin, Triumph and Tragedy, said that Stalin was reported saying this: "Who is going to remember all of these deaths in 10 or 20 years? No one." Well, Stalin was wrong. Today, we still remember the evil atrocities that have happened during the Soviet Union. Now, both Justin and I would agree that what Stalin did was evil, okay? Even if Stalin thought that it was morally permissible or that the Communist Party justified it because the legal system of the time and the leader himself, he permitted genocide. Regardless, it was still wrong. Now, international law today, which supersedes particular cultures, would condemn this act as a human rights violation. Just like the suppression of women's rights, human trafficking, and racial discrimination. We might have believed that racial discrimination was okay in the 1890s, but it's still objectively true regardless of whether the culture thought it was good at the time. And I think Justin and I would believe in that objective standard. Now, if Justin was asked, why was this wrong? I think he could make a case, even without referencing God. He might say, mass genocide does not lead to the survival and human flourishing of sentient beings. It leads to starvation, pain, psychological trauma. Also, randomly killing people will not build trust and cooperation within your species group. Justin might further even add that maybe evolution has a mechanism involved to allow the individual to have a sense of empathy so that it will aid you in survival. Now, I would agree with some of these statements, but then I would ask Justin the following question. Is genocide evil because it prevents human well-being, or is it evil regardless of what you or your DNA think? If you say that it is evil because genocide prevents human well-being, well, we could conceive of a world in which Stalin won the war, that he brainwashed everyone into believing that what he did was morally permissible, and then it became a social norm. Even if your genes and the DNA used to think genocide was evil, wouldn't it need to adapt to this new way of thinking? If you don't adapt, you are not socially cooperating with the majority's opinion. And if you don't cooperate with the majority's opinion, you're being a rebellious genetic mutation. And if the majority finds out you could be exterminated, this will not maximize your utility. This will not maximize your human well-being. Richard Dawkins said on page 69 of his book, The Selfish Gene, that the best strategy for an individual depends on what the majority of the population are doing. Now, I hope that Richard doesn't think that that premise is true in a corrupt society. Now, if you say that genocide is wrong regardless of what you or your genes think, then it must be grounded in something other than your opinion or the process of naturalistic evolution. The example above eliminates naturalistic evolution as the source for objective moral values, since we have shown that it can change depending on the situation. So then I attest the fact that objective moral values must exist and found in God's unchanging character. Contrary to what atheists might say, God's commands are not arbitrary. They're not random like genes or genetic mutation or evolution. But there is an objective rightness of justice, and there's an objective wrongness of hatred, discrimination, and genocide. Number 2, any sufficient moral system should explain the connection between free will and human responsibility. The Oxford Dictionary defines free will as the power of acting without constraint or necessity, the ability to act at one's own discretion. So when we say a person has free will, we are showing that someone has the ability to understand right from wrong, to choose freely to do either good or evil. This makes sense if God exists. Because God is a non-physical spiritual being, he is not controlled, he is not coerced by anything external or internal. So then if we see that because he is not limited to that his mind, it's not just a physical chemical process in the brain state. So if I speak rudely to my wife, I am obligated to confess my wrongness, seek forgiveness, and take responsibility for my wrong behavior. I can't say that the prefrontal cortex in my brain state was messed up that day as an excuse not to apologize. Atheist Sam Harris said in his book, Free Will, a person's conscious thoughts, intentions, and efforts at every moment are preceded by causes of which he is unaware. What is more, they are preceded by deep causes, genes, childhood experience, for which no one, however evil, can be morally justified. He says they cannot be held morally responsible. Even Michael Shermer said in his book, The Science of Good and Evil, if you abandon free will in favor of naturalism, moral responsibility flies out the courtroom window. End of quote. So then next time you say something rude to your wife, cheat on your exam, or get pulled over speeding by a cop, just tell them, I'm simply an organic machine at the mercy of the physical reactions in my body. See if they let you off the hook for breaking that moral code. My third and final point is that any sufficient moral system should explain human values and rights. A professor I had in school was physically and emotionally abused by his mother. He shared 2 instances from his childhood where he almost died from her hands. When he was just a toddler, his mom came in and she was vodka drunk. And she decided to unleash all this pain and violence at him, and threw him down the stairs. He almost died. He shared another time when he was in middle school and his brother and him were out playing, and mom was angry again and she started shooting at him. Literally shooting, and there was a bullet in his bike as a result. When we think of these stories, we find that these acts are wrong because humans are intrinsically valuable and they have rights. And these rights are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So when I mean intrinsic, I am saying that the professor, my professor, and everyone else in this world are valuable, regardless of what anyone thinks. Because his mom thought he was invaluable, well, she was wrong. Professor struggled to think he was valuable because of all the physical abuse that led to his low self-esteem, but he was still valuable. Unfortunately, society didn't think he was that valuable. He was going in and out of the foster care system, and he found a lot of troubling times there. So what options are left? Either his genes through a process of naturalistic evolution, or a God who loves him unconditionally. Let's ask the DNA. His genes are half right. They do care about Professor to survive and flourish. Maybe to survive, he needs to have the mechanism, the defense mechanism, to think positively about himself so that he can have the willpower to overcome his mother. However, the genes don't really care about the psychological trauma he felt as a child. DNA doesn't possess empathy. DNA is not a possessing personality. They only care about survival. Even one of the most famous atheists, Michael Roos, once said, objective morality is a corporate illusion. It's an illusion that has been deceiving us by our genes to get us to cooperate. What Roos is saying here is that genes don't really believe that there's anything intrinsically wrong with physical abuse. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a roadmap, a roadblock that keeps you away from surviving longer. So this, of course, is a problem for the naturalist, especially when you ask, where do moral values come from? This is the question to tonight's debate. What is the basis for morality? Why think that an impersonal, physical, valueless process will produce valuable people? From valueless, valueless comes. Furthermore, how can you tell a material physical property like the genes in your DNA that has extension and shape and size and color to produce moral values? A physical property may be red, smooth to the touch, or 5 feet tall, but it can't measure or weigh justice. You can't measure or weigh the wrongness of physical abuse. So I believe God is the better explanation because his value properties are in a personal justice, loving God. So in conclusion, I have argued that it's more rational to believe that God is the basis for God is the basis for morality than naturalism or anything else.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to Justin's opening statement.
Check. All right. All right, excellent. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is great. Thank you, Chad. I'm going to start tonight with somebody who's really important to me. His name's H.L. Mencken. He was a writer and a journalist, and the consummate iconoclast. He wrote once that a person's conscience is the inner voice which warns us that someone may be looking. He also said in a rather pithy remark that Puritanism or incessant moralizing is the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, may be happy. With that, I wish my opponent good luck, and we hope we find a middle ground between simply a good conscience and Puritanism. Let's begin with a story. In the late 1980s, in the height of the Cold War, there was a phrase that Ronald Reagan would say a lot to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and it was "Doverye, no proverye," which is an old Russian folk aphorism which means trust but verify. In other words, we have to see if a source is reliable before we actually want to test the veracity or truthiness of a claim. We can't just go with our tuitions, but we do trust our intuitions all the time, whether stopping abruptly at a stoplight, running quickly to another room to see if a child or a pet is okay, or simply bending to the will of spell checker. We are hardwired to trust our intuitions. It's a product of our natural proclivities. But we should also verify what we intuit is actually reliable. This is the very essence of the skeptic mindset and how I approach the world and how I'll approach this debate tonight. One of the key human beliefs that many trust as intuitive is the belief in God or gods, and that this God or gods serve as the foundation for their moral being. I simply find this belief both untenable and indefensible, and we'll be arguing the negative stance this evening. My hope is to show you that not only is a theistic-based morality untenable, secular morality provides a more reliable and effective ethical outlook. Morality, as I define it, and Chad talked a little bit about it, is a system of values and actions that advances the flourishing and limits the suffering of and between sentient beings. Sentient beings, broadly defined, are those beings that at a minimum can experience suffering and or experience flourishing, happiness, or well-being. My two main core arguments against theistic morality are philosophical and scriptural. For the purposes of this evening and the ground rules laid by both my opponent and I, my focus will be Christianity. I'd love to do more, and I'd imagine my opponent would as well, but we like to have lives outside of debates. First, the philosophical objections to a God-based morality. The main thrust of the theistic moral argument is something called the divine command theory, made prominent throughout Christianity by St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and modern-day religious apologists like William Lane Craig and Frank Turek. Divine command theory argues that whatever is in conjunction with God's innate goodness, Augustine's words, is itself necessarily moral. In other words, something is moral because God says it is. An example of this would be murder. In the Ten Commandments, it states that murder is wrong, and since they were in accordance with God's commands, murder is necessarily wrong. Theists argue this position for its conciseness and its appearance of objectivity. In reality, this version of theistic morality is anything but objective. One of the classic examples of the failures of divine command theory is Plato's Euthyphro dilemma. In this classic dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro, Socrates posits a question that gets to the heart of the failure of divine command theory. He originally writes it as thus: is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Socrates was trying to understand the distinction between piety and impiety, but this argument can easily be applied to immorality as well. Thus, if you change the wording of it, as many have in philosophical circles, it gets to the essence of divine command theory's ineffectiveness. Are morally good acts willed by God because they are morally good, or are they morally good because they're willed by God? If the former is true, then morality exists independently of God's desires, and therefore his existence bears no weight on it. If the latter is true, then all is morally permissible, because God can will anything to be moral. In a sense, rape, murder, and theft can be deemed morally permissible if said God decreed that it went along with his essence. Divine command theory is the very embodiment of moral relativism, which argues that anything can be morally good if one thinks that it is, or that morality is necessarily contingent on culture, individual beliefs, etc. If my opponent attempts to paint my worldview as relativistic, I suggest he not use divine command theory, or it will be a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. A more robust version of theistic moral philosophy, in the vein of Christianity, is the theory of divine justice. Many theists argue that since there's little justice in this world, it is sufficient to suggest that a divine lawgiver can help mete out justice in an afterlife, usually described in Christianity as heaven, the good place, or hell, the bad place. Divine justice reasserts the claim that God has created an objective moral standard for all of us and can apply these objective standards to us in an afterlife. Besides the obvious issues of boldly asserting the existence of God, or the creation of objective standards, or an afterlife without defining its actual physical entity or potential realm, the theory of divine justice has no bearing on moral action in this life, where it matters. If God is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent, meaning all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, as theists often define him, why can't he just carry out justice in this world where it has real effect? This is the point that both philosophers David Hume and Aristotle actually made, as understood by philosopher Eric Weilenberg. If flourishing of sentient beings is the goal, wouldn't God's justice be more applicable here, in this time? Consequences of moral and immoral actions affect us now, and God's decision to wait until the afterlife to do anything is both callous and unnecessary. So can systems of moral obligation be established in the secular world? Definitely. This is the point Immanuel Kant made in his writing on ethics. A deontological view of ethics, meaning moral action in conjunction with adherence to rules and standards, exists within a Kantian framework. Since objective, morally obligatory actions could be carried out, divine justice in an afterlife serves no purpose, because humans following said rules would do so without any consideration to rewards or punishments in this life as opposed to next. Divine justice is just a larger symptom of what Bertrand Russell called the wish for safety, a sort of feeling that there's a big brother who will look after you. Will this may comfort others? A celestial authoritarian whose only moral compunctions that coincide with administering justice terrifies me. Because morality becomes less about the flourishing of sentient beings and more about a wanton and capricious and a subjective lawgiver. So with the philosophical out of the way, let's deal with the biblical. Christian believers around the world, many of which are in this room tonight, would argue that their sense of morality is deeply connected to the inspired Word of God, aka the Bible. Is this really the case? Even a cursory glance at the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, would mortify even the most hardened of hearts. Some of the rules prescribed in the Bible are downright laughable today and mostly not followed, such as the restriction against mixed fabrics, the inability to eat shrimp or shellfish in general, or my personal favorite, stoning your children if you talk back to them. These are all in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. While these are largely innocuous today, There are also many passages in the Bible that many of us would find morally repugnant, such as the right of a woman's rapist to buy her from her father. That's from Deuteronomy 22. God's slaughter of innocent people. Lots of passages, most notably 1 Samuel 15, where God slaughters the men, the women, the children, the ox, the ass, all kinds of stuff. And the most immoral crime that the Bible really doesn't address at all, slavery. Slavery is a big sticking point for me. You know, in the Ten Commandments, it would have been easy for God to put in don't rape and don't own other people as property, but he apparently couldn't do it. In fact, the Bible not only doesn't abolish slavery, it actually gives you the guidebook for how to treat them. Exodus chapter 21 explicitly tells a slave owner how to deal with their slaves, including your right to sell your daughter into slavery, your right to keep a slave's family independent of them after they're freed after 7 years, and the right of slave owners to beat them to near death so long as they live 2 days later. The other Bible story that shows that God is not interested in morality is Abraham and Isaac, Genesis 22, 1 through 18. God asked Abraham to kill his son Isaac. And being a faithful man of God, Abraham obeys by attempting to stab his son with a knife. Right before Abraham does this horrible deed, God tells him to stop, acknowledging Abraham's obedience to God. Christians describe this story as about being faithful and fulfilling to God's wishes. The way I see it, God is not interested in the well-being of Abraham and Isaac. He's purely interested in obedience and happily perverts the faith and dedication of Abraham to his own selfish ends. This does not sound like a particularly kind or loving God to me. It sounds more like a subjective moral authoritarian without an objective moral standard. Now that's the Old Testament. New Testament has to be better, right? That's when Jesus Christ comes into the picture. Does it get any better? Not really. For the New Testament, I will specifically focus on Jesus and some of the lesser-known passages of the New Testament. Most important of these passages is Matthew 10, 34 to 37. In this passage, Jesus says, "Think not that I have come to send peace on earth. I come not to send peace, but a sword. For I come to set a man at variance against his father, and his daughter against his mother, and the daughter-in-law against his mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be they of his own household. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." Jesus not only calls for violence over peace, he actually asks his followers to take violence against their families. So much for family values. Now, what about the violence, the sexual perversion, and the slavery of the Old Testament? Jesus has to decry that, right? Wrong again. Earlier in the book of Matthew 5:17, Jesus says, "Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Not only does this show that Jesus was a bit ambiguous about whether his followers were Jewish, it also shows that he has no moral qualms with the slaughter of the Old Testament. And what about non-believers like me, or those who follow a different faith? Oh, not much wiggle room for them either. "If a man abideth not in me, he is cast forth as a branch, and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned." John 15:6. Now, none of what I've just said disproves God or his supposed commitment to morality at all. And for every bad Bible quote, a good one can be found. All this shows is that the Bible is not an objective moral book. Its contradictions and barbarities negate its very usefulness in that realm and calls to question the supposed benevolence of Christianity. So if God is not the basis of morality, what is? I think it comes from a couple main components. The first is what I call the moral instinct, and the second I call the moral framework. The moral instinct is a product of our evolution. The field of evolutionary psychology, most notably written by scholars Michael Shermer and Mark Hauser, among others, looks into the relationship between empathy, shame, and guilt, and how individuals within species naturally intuit responses, creating a rudimentary, if flawed, moral foundation. The moral framework, however, applies more to us. Social, economic, and political frameworks create shared rules and guidelines that emphasize moral action among individuals. I am not suggesting that the sole moral agent is the group. It is actually the individual, and how individuals relate and frame moral action in a shared social cooperative. Philosopher W.D. Ross developed this type of ethic, and it's called situational ethics, which emphasizes shared rules that are then applied to situations. This is not moral relativism in any sense. Relativism has no relationship to shared rules or advancing well-being. Ross's ethic is an offshoot of virtue ethics, Aristotle's moral theory that advocates for what he called the golden mean, the best possible moral choice within competing values and competing situations. In sum, morality is a messy, messy thing, occasionally lacking clear choices or decisions. But that doesn't mean that it's relative or subjective or at the caprice of a self-appointed deity. That's what religious morality is. Matt Dillahunty said it best when he said that religions do not offer moral prescriptions. They offer moral pronouncements. Morality is too important to leave to the whim of superstition and wishful thinking. I urge you to consider the negative stance of the motion this evening, and anything I did not get to right here, I will happily answer in the rebuttal and the Q&A. Thank you. I'll yield my time for the close.
Okay. So now we move to, if I can get this set, 10-minute rebuttals. Back to Chad. He has the floor, and then Justin will present his rebuttal.
So as you recall from my opening statement, I argued that it is more rational to believe that morals originated from an intrinsically valuable, intelligent creator than for morals to have emerged evolutionarily through a valueless, non-intelligent, cause and effect physical process. I defended this argument with 3 criteria, which were objective morals, free will, and human value. Justin did raise the following counter-arguments against my position in the opening statement. The statement he started out with was called the Euthyphro dilemma. And the Euthyphro dilemma basically says, is it good because God says so, or is it good independent of God? If God says it's good, then they say his commands are arbitrary, for God himself could say, I'm going to cause murder or violence or innocence, and so it's arbitrary. Now, if you say that it's not from God and it's independent of God, then you have an objective standard that is above God. And if it's above God, then God himself is inferior to something else. So they have a supposed contradiction here. Now, if you remember from my opening statement, I actually do the Euthyphro dilemma in the evolutionary sense. If you didn't catch it, I said, is genocide evil because it prevents human well-being, or is it evil regardless of what you or your DNA think? See, there's the Euthyphro dilemma for the naturalist. And so the only thing that I have that I think trumps his is the idea of empathy and virtue and value, because human well-being could be a rapist. He could get his human well-being from things that are wicked and evil. So the Euthyphro dilemma is the same in an evolutionary perspective. So Justin still needs to refute my thesis on the other 2. He needs to explain how atheism can account for free will as it responds to moral responsibility. When I say naturalistic evolution, I'm not talking about theistic evolution, though I am a creationist. I'm talking about naturalism in a sense that everything is reduced to physical, chemical, cause and effect physical processes. So how do you get free will there would be something that I would like to hear from him. And then the third thing is, once again, human value and empathy. How does it arise? So on to the, and he brought up some good stuff. So let's talk about the context of the Bible. So let's talk about the 10 Commandments. They did talk about do not murder, do not steal, do not kill, do not commit adultery. And God, in fact, was against slavery, contrary to what he said, because in Exodus 21:16, it says, anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. The type of slavery he's talking about is antebellum slavery in the 19th century. The slavery in the Old Testament is like you have a student loan and you owe debt to your student loan, so that's out of context. Slavery was not racially motivated. Abraham said that all the families of the earth shall be blessed, and even Moses married a mixed Cushite from the Egyptian tribe, so I don't think that works. The year of Jubilee, every 7 years, a slave was allowed to, the person was allowed to be freed. every 7 years. And if they wanted to continue to stay with their master, if they didn't pay off their debt, they were set free, or they could stay with their master for the remainder of their lives. You wouldn't see this in any other Near Eastern ancient culture, trust me. Women are treated better. Surrounding nations had female temple prostitution, sacrificed their sons and daughters to Moloch, and God renounced that in the book of Leviticus. Women were treated better, and you had women leaders. So it was not a patriarchal society. It was a patriarchal society, but the Bible, those in the Old Testament actually superseded their own culture. Miriam was a daughter of Aaron. She was a leader during Exodus. Deborah was a judge who headed an army with Barack, not Barack Obama, but Barack from the Bible. So there's also 2 Old Testament books devoted to women, Esther and Ruth, and it talks about the remarkable faith from women. So this is unheard of in ancient Near East. So let's talk about his binding of Isaac. So if you read on the evening news, some crazy person told me to murder someone, should that be justified? God told me to do so. Well, it depends on the situation, because you can't just say that. It's all, the person could be deluded. The person would be crazy. So you have to look at the genre in the binding of Isaac. So there's historical narrative, there's poetry, and there's wisdom literature. Historical narrative focuses on major themes throughout the narrative. The book is all about God's promise. So number 1, Abraham told to leave his home and go to the promised land. 2, God promised Abraham he would bless his descendants. 3, Abraham doubted God's promise because Sarah could not conceive. Okay? So look at the backdrop before we get to the binding of Isaac. So at 100 years old, God tells Sarah that she will conceive a son. Why is Isaac called Isaac? Because she laughed. Because she said, there's no way that you'll fulfill your promise, God, because I'm 100 years old. So he kept his promise. This is all the backdrop. Think about what Abraham's going through. 5, Abraham was told to go to Mount Moriah. The same word go in the Hebrew word is used when he left his homeland. So once again, promise. The theme, promise. 5, Mount Moriah is the Hebrew word rajah, which means provide. So God is already hinting at salvation and deliverance. 7, Abraham told his young men to stay back while his son, and he worshiped, and he used the plural. We will return. He didn't use I will return. So it doesn't sound like Abraham had any intention of sacrificing his own son Isaac. Remember, it's all about the context. If I said to you today, Jack and Jill are swimming, you might say, okay. But if I said Jack and Jill were swimming in their fishbowl, you would get a totally different idea. That's kind of what Justin and other atheists do. And actually, Michael Roos laughs about atheist Richard Dawkins taking things out of context. Massacre and ethnic cleansing. Why would God allow the Israelites to completely wipe out the surrounding nations? Now, I will say, this is a tough subject, and he's right. You have to bring these up. Once again, let's talk about the context. First thing, the notion of utterly destroying something in one day, this kind of mass crusade, that's a false idea. It took 400 years for the Israelites to take out the Canaanites during that time period. So it wasn't like 10 years and all of a sudden he just wiped out all these people. It took 400 years. 2, ancient Near Eastern texts all have exaggeration rhetoric. Okay? Egypt's Thutmose III said he totally annihilated the army of Mitanni in one day, even though he was fighting them for 2 centuries. So once again, exaggeration rhetoric is being used. So if I say, Kentucky is just demolishing their opponents, am I being misleading by saying the word demolish? No, it's all about the context. So Kentucky is just playing a basketball game. So let's talk a little bit more. The battles, they happened in military areas. Jericho and Ai, and the one that he described, the 1 Samuel 15, are just examples where Joshua says he'll destroy every living thing. These cities were used for government buildings and operations, while the rest of the people, women and children, lived in the surrounding countryside. So if you do archaeological evidence, you'll find that the women and children and all of them were not in those particular areas. Furthermore, Joshua 11:19 shows that the peace treaties could be made. There were peace treaties that could be made, but Gibeon and Jericho, they rejected the offer of peace. This was an attitude of grace. They weren't just wanting to destroy the Amalekites. They weren't just wanting to destroy the Canaanites. Now let's talk about more context. God's greater concern was to get rid of the Canaanite religion. So you might say, how judgmental of them, but remember, the Canaanites worshipped a god called Baal. And Baal would tell women to go into temple prostitution, basically modern day sex slavery. Okay? And they would say that if you worship this god, then your crops would be fertilized, as they're abusing women in their temple prostitution areas. We also know from the context that the god of Moloch was being offered and their children were dying every day. So God was being very gracious for 400 years not to wipe out people that were so unjust. It'd be like modern day genocide going on with Saddam Hussein, mustard gassing his own people. I think there's justification to go into those areas, just war theory. So in conclusion, I think it's important to read anything in its immediate context. And it's also a double-sided coin. Now, he may say Adolf Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin had a background in religion, but when we start to read his philosophical positions like Nietzsche and his idea of the Übermensch and the superior race, we'll find that atheism has the same problem as well.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Okay. 10-minute rebuttal.
May I add my 1 minute for my opening statement to this, please?
Is that acceptable,
Yeah.
Chad?
Thank
Okay.
you. Excellent.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Reset.
Awesome. Very good. He brought up a lot of great points. And interestingly enough, I'll deal with the Bible stuff first. And one thing I'll just say, is that the sheer fact that he sort of had to constantly hedge his bet and talk about context and talk about history, to me, that kind of makes my point, which is this idea that why would we ever use this as a guidebook for life? I mean, you could probably find more morality in Dostoevsky or Victor Hugo than you could find in the Holy Bible. Or you could find it in like Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. Treat them as literary works in which context is incredibly important. History is extremely important. But should we base an entire system of belief on it? I think that's rather questionable. In terms of Chad's question on free will, I am not in agreement with Sam Harris. I am not a determinist. I'm what's called philosophically a compatibilist. I'm in the middle on that. I kind of agree with Daniel Dennett, who wrote a fantastic book on the subject called Freedom Evolves. And it's this idea that sentient beings have varying degrees of freedom. I have more freedom of action and thought than, say, a dog. And a dog has more freedom of thought and action than a bird. And a bird has more thought and action, more thought and action than, say, like an insect. And this idea that as consciousness becomes more integrated into our evolutionary framework, we have more options. Now, to be honest with you, I'm never going to be able to go through that wall. I mean, unless I get like a sledgehammer or something. But the sheer fact that I have the ability to just stop doing this, I could leave, I could do anything within the realm of my choices as a moral actor within a physical universe. Yes, I am a naturalist, and I'm also an atheist. I'm just going to say it out loud and be proud about the fact that we do not have to hide behind that label. Now, in terms of, the big four, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, all those guys, Hitler's first official action with the Third Reich was to be officially sanctioned by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church supported the Third Reich in its early years. Also, Joseph Stalin did have a background in seminary, and he also was heavily anti-science and anti-evolution. And in my argument, I would argue that religion, just like any ideology, can lead a civilization astray. And communism is the same way. In fact, in many ways, I'm more of a free market guy myself. And to be honest with you, communism just ekes me out. And so to me, treating it as if it's a religion, like you would take Karl Marx and treat it like you would the Bible, is just not a good recipe for moral action. But the one thing I do want to talk about a lot is this idea that he sort of does this interesting thing where he'll posit an idea but does not provide evidence for it. So for example, he posits that it's more rational to believe that a God is the source of morality. but yet does not effectively show the evidence for that assumption. One, he really doesn't go into the fact about how even if God exists. Now, I know that was a different debate we would do tonight, but I would like to hear a little bit more about the ontological or deontological arguments for God. A little bit, at least to define what your God is, and more importantly, to connect him to moral action. That's something that I would find quite important. The next thing I would find is, why would you even posit the idea of God being connected to morality? Just because somebody created something doesn't mean they will always have permanent dominion over it. I mean, I think that's kind of a problematic idea. And this idea that we have to always bend to the will of them, which we do if we want to get into the good place, is just problematic to me. And so we have to think about those particular problems. I'll also like to talk about the Euphophro dilemma a little bit. I don't think Chad really got the Euphophro dilemma. By the way, it's Euphophro. There you go. So the Euphophro dilemma. So it is it pious because it is loved by the gods, or is it loved by the gods because it is pious? It is what is called a parenthetical statement. It's most like John F. Kennedy's "ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." It's a way of reversing things. What he actually did when he was describing a naturalistic version of the Euphophro dilemma was say two particularly different things that were not synced to one another. If he were to actually make a naturalistic argument that was a Euphophro dilemma, he would say, is it moral because evolution says it is, or does evolution, or is it evolution because it's moral, which would kind of become nonsensical. So we have to think about that. The other thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is the stuff on slavery. So I don't know about you, but owning people, no matter what time, no matter what place, and no matter what race, is wrong. It's just wrong. It is in violation of their individual rights. It's in violation of their individual right to exit. It is against their individual right of freedom of thought and freedom of action, which I do believe we do. Chad and I have common ground on that. And so I think that just this idea that we have to treat it as like, oh, it was indentured servitude, we don't have to worry about that. Yeah, but it also says in Exodus 21 that they can beat up their slaves and beat them really, really bad, and if they live after 2 days, it's okay. And then in terms of women in the Bible, there's another passage that also says that women have no ability to speak on actions referring to moral action on or physical action in the world. So I always think it's interesting when you see somebody like Joyce Meyer preaching, because the Bible really wouldn't want that. So for me, I think the other thing I'd like to discuss as well is that we have a fundamental issue here with what he called the exaggeration rhetoric in the Bible, which is this idea that the exaggeration rhetoric thing is really bothersome to me. It's the idea of comparing genocide to a basketball game. They're not morally equivalent to me. And I think we have to treat that a little bit more seriously. Now, the issue I think I have is with this idea that we have to establish God's moral framework. We have to establish that for on Chad's side if it's actually the case. Now, the thing that I think is interesting is he called him immaterial and not of this universe, but yet makes decisions in this universe. I would like to hear from my opponent about why something that's immaterial and non-material and not of this universe cares about what goes on in this universe. Because he could create it or not. He exists whether it's here or not. Why does it matter what happens? That's really important to me. I'd like to hear that connection. The other issue I have is this idea of contextualizing things. We do have to contextualize things. So let's contextualize Hitler. In Mein Kampf, Hitler does refer to Jesus Christ in multiple times. There's also, in the Third Reich's history, a long strain of what's called the Aryan Jesus theory, which is this idea that Jesus is the ultimate Aryan. So they kind of make Jesus German, which is kind of interesting. But it's this idea that they truly did believe it. On the belt buckles of the Nazis, it said Gott mit uns, which is with God on our side. And there was also a very high up order within the Third Reich that was of the occult. So it was this weird mixture of Christianity, specifically Catholicism, with occult beliefs, paganism and early forms of Satanism. They did intermingle within the Third Reich. Not to mention the fact that Hitler was also an anti-science proponent. He was very much against Darwin. But the other thing he did, and a lot of people of that era did this too, is they did something called the anthropic fallacy, which is this idea that we can make value claims about things that happen in the physical sciences or the physical world. David Hume calls this the is-ought problem. Just because you have an is, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have an ought. You cannot derive an ought from an is. At least that's the traditional view of it. Now, Hume made that argument originally to make the point about, well, if God is the creator of the universe, why ought he have anything to say about morality? And that's actually the original point that Hume makes in an essay concerning understanding. Now, the thing I think is interesting about the is-ought problem is talking about my side of it, which is secular ethics, is this idea that I don't necessarily think we can derive is from oughts. But I do think that is statements and facts about the natural world inform our actions. They inform what we do. And so they don't necessarily automatically determine what we do, but they have a very important, powerful influence on what we do. We live in a physical world and in a physical universe with physical laws and physical properties. And regardless of what your belief is, we do all have to function in that. I mean, I don't know about some of you, but we do have to function with some of that, right? Mm-hmm. And so regardless of what your beliefs are, you do have to deal with the physical universe and physical laws, and so they do inform what you do. And so it's very important for me to get that understanding across, because it's this idea that we can take the sciences, whether it's evolutionary psychology or it's game theory, which is a lot about economics, experimental economics, where we can understand the relationship between economic agents and markets as a whole. All of these different fields of scientific and social scientific study help illuminate our moral choices. So we can't necessarily derive is from oughts. I agree with Chad on that completely. And I think that was the point that Hume made. But the other thing I would say is that is statements about the real world and about the physical universe can help us understand the choices and the moral actions that we take. And so that's really a fundamental issue that I have, is this idea that why is God's existence necessarily contingent on how we act in this moral realm, in this physical world, in this physical universe? Those are the issues at stake here, and I really feel like we need to have a more firm foundation on the supposed existence of God and his supposed connection to morality. I'll yield my time.
We now go to 5-minute closing statements, beginning with Chad.
All right, so Justin brought up some other good points. Let me just talk briefly about kind of the history and the context. He said that when I talked about the history and the context of the Bible, I could take that out of context with people like Stalin or Hitler or anything like that. I won't get into too much detail because that was not the point of the discussion, but I will say that Stalin was a religious figure, okay? Stalin is reported of going to a Russian Orthodox seminary. There's no doubt about that. But it would be equivalent to me saying I was raised in a Catholic home and then after I left, I became an atheist or agnostic. I mean, that doesn't really, there's not really a connection there if your family member was a believer or not. Now, he did go to seminary, but then he repudiated his Christian claims. He even was reported saying, the Pope, how many divisions has he got? So this is an obvious criticism. Adolf Hitler, his mom was a Catholic, devout Jew, she was a Catholic and she was devoutly religious, and his father was an anti-Semite. Okay, so he did hate the Jewish people, but in terms of what he was, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, which was Hitler's closest associate, wrote in his diary about in Hitler's wars, and it says that Hitler hated Christianity because it had crippled all that was noble in humanity. So someone who is really studious, as Justin Clark is, brought up a good point. He said in Mein Kampf, his language was of divine providence. He's right. He is absolutely right. Now, there is a British historian, Lawrence Rees, who said, had Hitler distanced himself of his movement too much from Christianity, it is all but impossible to see how he could ever have been successful in a free election. So Hitler used religion for his own political end, just like we see in politics. But Hitler definitely had a materialistic outlook based on 19th century rationalism. And as I said, the idea of the Übermensch, and Nietzsche wrote a book called Thus Spake Zarathustra in 1892, I believe, which was like 5 or 6 years before Adolf Hitler was born. So there should be, I'm not saying that's necessarily a connection, but we once again can argue the rebuttal on that. So you're left with a choice. Based on the evidence, which worldview do you think is more rational? Is it better explained that valueless, non-intelligent forces in the universe spontaneously created the concept of morality? Or did it come from a valuable, intelligent creator, God? Now, I am a creationist, but I'm actually saying that naturalistic evolution is even further from theistic evolution. I am a creationist, but I don't understand the valueless to value problem. I don't see, as even Hume said, the is-ought distinction. You can only say moral facts. You can't say why moral facts ought to be. They're two different physical, one is physical and one is metaphysical. Now, there is an idea called the supervenian moral principles that some moral realist from moral realism has argued, and we could get into that. But once again, the ontological foundation from an atheistic view is found wanting. So it makes more sense to me that God hardwired morality into our brains. When I see a building, I don't think it spontaneously came out from nothing. There was an architect, an intelligent mind, who put thought and effort into creating it. When I see a computer, I imagine the input and the output, math configurations, and its complexity must have been created by a designer. I'm going to leave you with 2 quotes with my concluding statement. Atheist Bertrand Russell says that man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears and loves and beliefs are but the outcome of accidental connections of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual's life beyond the grave. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to die in the vast heat of the death of the universe. Here's the other quote. Oh, my soul, bless God. Don't forget a single blessing. He forgives your sin, everyone. He heals your diseases. He crowns you with love and mercy, a paradise crown. He makes everything come out right. He puts victims back on their feet. He doesn't treat us like we ought to be treated, but pays us back in full for our wrongs, making everything right for them and their children. God has set his throne in heaven, and he loves all of us. Thank you.
Closing statement, 5 minutes from Justin.
A couple notes on the Nietzsche part. Yes, that was a very integral part of the Third Reich's rise. One thing I will say, though, about Nietzsche himself was that Nietzsche, in fact, a lot of historical people make historians make the argument that Nietzsche was an anti-Semite, when in fact that's actually not the case. The composer Richard Wagner was an anti-Semite. When he wrote an opera critical of the Jewish faith, in fact, Nietzsche distanced himself, and he wrote an entire tract called Nietzsche contra Wagner, where he decried that anti-Semitism. That doesn't make Nietzsche any better. I mean, the Übermensch is kind of an ideal. It doesn't really exist in the real world, and I would not defend the Übermensch at all. Also, the translations that Hitler tended to use were written by Nietzsche's sister, and she sort of had a political motive, which was that she sort of wrote them for the Third Reich. She rewrote Nietzsche. So we didn't actually get great translations of Nietzsche until way after the 1960s, at least in the English language, by Walter Kaufmann. So as I've hoped to have shown you tonight, God is not the basis of morality. By the way, the debate question was, is God the basis of morality? Not, is evolution the basis of morality? I can make that point, and I would, but my point was the burden of proof is not on me. The burden of proof is on him. And so I would like to hear a little bit more in the Q&A. Hopefully you guys will have great questions. I imagine you will. A little bit more about what is his God and what is its connection to morality, because I did not hear that from his rebuttal. So God is really not the basis of morality, and honestly never has been. And as I've gone through the biblical arguments and the philosophical arguments, you'll notice that God is in many ways a subjective dictator, at least in the eyes of the Bible. And I know we've had constant appeals to context and history, but the sheer fact that we have to make those appeals kind of points to an error about why we should base our entire worldview on a book that has about as much literary merit as the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's not to say that there are not moral Christians. There are. In fact, what motivated me to do this tonight was not my side. I mean, they're with me. They're my home team. I don't care about them necessarily being on my side, because they will be. It'll get bad. But I care about the Christians, to be honest with you. Some of the most wonderful, kind, and charitable people that I know are religious. My grandmother believes in a God, and she's more moral than I will ever be. What I'm saying is that the believers whose lives are shaped by their faith are infinitely better than the religion that they believe in. The morality isn't a subset of their belief. It's a precondition of their internal benevolence. They represent what Christopher Hitchens so beautifully said: human decency is not derived from religion, it precedes it. At the end of the day, this debate is really about the meaning of life. The only life we're guaranteed to have, which is this one. How are we supposed to act towards one another? And how do those actions affect our society and our species? For me, astronomer Carl Sagan said it best when he wrote, "The significance of our lives and our fragile planet is then determined only by our wisdom and courage. We are the custodians of life's meaning. We long for a parent to take care of us, to forgive us our errors, to save us from our childish mistakes. But knowledge is preferable to ignorance. Better by far to embrace the hard truth than a reassuring fable. If we crave some cosmic purpose, then let us find ourselves a worthy goal. We steer our own ship. We write our own course, and we don't need the appeals to magical thinking or wonder stuff. My disbelief in God doesn't diminish my ability to love, to empathize, to be charitable, to be productive and considerate of others. We should stop trying to find a meaning of life outside of it and actively pursue a meaning that belongs to all of us, that lives within all of us. For me, a secular world gives us just that, especially with morality. As H.L. Mencken also said, to tie my nice little debate into a neat little bow, the Christian always swears a bloody oath that he will never do it again. The civilized man simply resolves to be a bit more careful next time. Let's all commit to being a bit more careful next time, and more than anything else, trust but verify. Thank you very much. I'll yield my time.
Thus concludes the formal portion of this debate. I have been given the wonderful privilege of composing and submitting some questions of my own to both of the debaters. And so I'd ask both debaters actually to take your podiums. And I have decided that I'd like to pose each of my questions and give you 1 minute and 30 seconds each to respond. Okay. And I'm also going to take the liberty of choosing the order of response for each of these. So I would actually like to hear Justin speak first to this question. And you'll have equal time on each one. Is it more important to the sound functioning of today's society for us to understand the origins of ideas about what is moral or immoral, or to understand current changes in ideas about what is moral or immoral? That is, how much does knowledge of morality's origins matter in contemporary society? That is my first question for both of you. So 1 minute and 30 seconds. Justin, please.
Sure, it definitely matters a lot. One of the kind of things I want to talk about a little bit in this brief section is that I think that philosophy and literature and art and even religious studies, I think, play a key and integral part in understanding the human experience. So like, I'm not one of those people who's what you would call a scientist, like a scientism or scientist, like somebody who sort of like believes in science the way, you know, people believe in religion. I don't try to do that. I think I think sometimes that the sum of its parts are often greater than the moral whole, and so we have to think about all those different things. Yeah, I would definitely include that. I think highlights in the history of moral philosophy, including the Greco-Roman figures, Plato, Aristotle, my personal favorite. Religious moral scholars. Saint Thomas Aquinas is genius. I mean, in terms of understanding natural rights, that's the first person to go to. And the Enlightenment tradition, Hume, David Hume, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, the thinkers that influenced our own American Revolution, as well as the rights revolutions that have gone throughout the world. I place a key emphasis on the Enlightenment tradition myself because it advances individual rights, individual sovereignty of your person, and more importantly, freedom of thought. So your freedom to worship or not worship at all. In fact, I would argue that the Enlightenment secular traditions, in fact, support a more religiously diverse world than just a strict religious morality. So yeah, I definitely think it's important.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, and I would agree with Justin. I think the idea of morality and the origin of values are vitally important. I mean, look at the idea of the cosmology. It used to be thought that the universe, and there are still cosmologists who believe that the universe is eternal, but for the most part, we've got new theories of the idea that there was a Big Bang, that there was a beginning point, a finite time when the universe came into existence, and that it's accelerating, that it's actually expanding. So they used to think that universes would contract and then they'd birth new universes. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't cosmologists that believe that, but they are starting to see that the laws and the constants of the universe the things they used to think are not the things they think anymore. And so when you think of origin for science and thinking about how everything came into existence is vitally important, because everything that starts from there is how you apply things. So if I believe that God is the objective standard of morality, then I have this idea of universally binding principles. I can't find that in a naturalistic evolutionary perspective, and maybe there is a case for that. And then lastly, things have changed over time. There are new ideas of neuroscience. It will change our society. If we think everything is biochemical processes, they might say one day we need to get the religion gene and pull it out of individual's brain. And Weilenberg talks about that in A Value and Virtue, Godless World, if you want to read his book.
Time's up. Thank you. Okay. My second question, and I would like for Chad to answer this first.
Okay.
What is the best course of action for a person to take if public policies, laws, and/or practices conflict with his or her own view of morality? Should majority rule when it comes to public influence on morality or not?
Very good question. We had a missionary who came from Germany, and public policy started to change. In 2005, there was an idea where a woman had a right to do what she wanted, and actually, that kind of language turned into legalizing prostitution. And so as a result of the majority rule, as a result of the culture at large, prostitution became legalized. And so what was once in a culture as deemed morally wrong became morally permissible, and their public policy and law had to change because the majority ruled, so they changed the law according to that. And what happened, there was a story told that the missionary went to try to get a job. His wife tried to get a job at the government building, and the government building asked, I want to be a teacher or, whatever you have on. And they even gave her the option to choose, do you want to be a prostitute? And so, unfortunately, as laws change and as public policy changes, and if the majority rules, then the majority could favor things that would be morally wrong. So that would be the reason why I think that the best course of action is to allow both the minority and the majority to decide on certain issues. So.
That was really nice. I was a very practical one. I was waiting for philosophy, which is what mine is, unfortunately. Actually, for me, I think the guidebook on this question is Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. I think that in terms of understanding what happens when a government's laws get away from what he called the moral or eternal law, it is up to us as democratic citizens in a society to be objectors and use nonviolent resistance. One thing I really want to stress about this is that this method is one of the biggest expansions of individual rights in this world's history. It has allowed for the expansion of civil rights for African Americans, the LGBT community, as well as immigrants and women. And I think that if we understand that civil disobedience, which is a beautiful tradition that goes back all the way back to Ralph Waldo Emerson and his essay on, Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. We live in a democratic republic. We don't live in a direct democracy, and that's for a good reason. Our Constitution and Bill of Rights secure not only the rights of the majority, but the rights of the minority. I believe that laws that violate individual rights without explicit purpose in the protection of safety are unnecessary and against the larger moral law, because I, like Chad, believe in natural rights. So yeah, that's how you do it.
All right.
Good job.
Okay. And my third and final question before we move to audience questions, and I think I'd like to hear Justin speak to this first. Do institutions of higher learning, such as the university, have a role in providing people education on moral issues? What type of education would be appropriate or inappropriate?
Excellent. That's a great question. I took 2 ethics courses in my undergrad, and I have a minor in philosophy, so I do really think that institutions of higher learning have an integral part in discussing this. I think we need to have classes where students explore moral philosophies and theories, understand their origins, understand the history of them, understand their context, and more importantly, have a stronger discussion about the relation of science to morality. I think it's been a long time where, unfortunately, it's kind of like science has been like the geeky kid in class that nobody likes and they've left him out in the hallway. I think it's about time we bring him back in and have him be an integral part of the story. And so I think when I was talking earlier about fields like evolutionary psychology, experimental economics, and neuroscience can help give us tools to understand moral action in the real world. So we can still talk about origins and whether there's a God or not, but in terms of like real world stuff, things that kind of affect us in our daily lives, I think it's great to have all different disciplines have a say in that. So, yeah.
Okay. Please.
I think education on moral issues is a very important role. Let me give you an example. There was a non-religious individual, and he had a propensity towards hating Muslim people. And if you heard from the story, he went and shot up this building thinking that they were Muslims when in fact they were Sikhs. And Sikhs look similar, but Sikhs have a different religious viewpoint. They believe in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, whereas the Muslims have a different worldview. So there was even so much so many caricatures of religions that they didn't even know, and they didn't know because of their ignorance. So education is vitally important for people to understand what's the difference between different various religions. I'm a proponent of what we're doing tonight because we're educating one another about that both sides have intellectual truths, and as much as we want to say one's right, we're presenting truth and we're talking about it and we're dialoguing it, because if we don't dialogue, especially in today's society, that elephant in the room is going to get bigger and bigger, and it's going to flow itself out into public policy, and our war of cultural division is going to continue on. Okay, so education is vitally important, and I think the universities have to take the step. They have to take the necessary steps so that what they teach will become influential into our public sector. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we move to time for audience questions. And I want to make sure that there are some ground rules around this as well. And these ground rules came from the debate participants. The first one is we have people with microphones up here. If you have a question for Chad, you would go in line on this side. If you have a question for Justin. But whatever question you ask will be responded to by both debate participants. It'll just be first one and then the other. We would ask that you ask your question within 30 seconds of being handed the microphone. That is, please don't provide a great deal of...
Don't be a C-SPAN caller.
Fair enough. If you know what a C-SPAN caller is. Not there really to espouse one position or the other very strongly or to rouse response, but instead to ask an honest question. We would just ask for honest questions. And so the way this will go is that the person to whom the question is primarily directed will have 2 minutes to respond to that question, and then the other side will have 1 minute, and we will take turns to make sure that each person has an equal opportunity and time to ask questions. So I would invite audience members who have questions to approach the microphones, and I will recognize you, one in each turn.
Oh no, don't ride. Give me a softball. No, I'm just joking.
I'll try my best.
Okay, yeah.
Chad, I'll go back to you since you won the original coin toss. Do you have a preference about who takes a
What do you want to
question
choose?
first?
I didn't go first. You're fine.
Okay,
You won the
I can go
coin toss.
first.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so the first question is going to be, Chad, being the coin toss winner, is going to be taking the first question. So go ahead, and then upon response, I'll begin the timer. So please.
Thank you for your time here. My question is quick. What criteria do you use to determine which holy book is the one you wish to follow? There are very different moralities between the Bible and the Quran and other holy books as well. What do you determine what is right and what morality you follow?
Very good question, Ryan. So just to give you a backdrop, I was raised in a Roman Catholic home, but we were very nominal in our religion. But as I got older, I started to doubt religion and started to doubt my faith. I became more of an agnostic, atheist. And then what happened was I had, ironically, some Mormons who came to share me about the Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints. And he was telling me a little bit about Joseph Smith and how he received the plates, and Angel Moroni spoke to him, and during the time of the 1800s. And so I didn't realize what Mormonism was, or Scientology, or Judaism, or Christianity, or Islam. I heard about them, but I started to explore different religions. So for example, I started to explore Mormonism. And as I was thinking about what holy book has the most valid historical significance. So in the history of Mormonism, there are some discrepancies on whether or not Joseph Smith, what he was doing in New York, and if he really received those tablets or not. He had a reputation that was not and so there was differences in terms of Mormonism. And then I started to look at other various religions, and what I noticed, so what's the difference between all of them? What I would say is everyone says that in order to go to heaven, you have to be a good person. Okay, you have to do this duty and that duty, and you have to do this religious work and that religious work. You got to go to the temple. You got to pray 5 times a day. You got to do all. It's like a treadmill of constant trying to work yourself up to be a good person. And that's in all religions except Christianity. Christianity says God came to you. You didn't go to him. God is your hero. And so God becomes the ultimate hero of the story. And so I show that it's not man-made religion, but it's God expressing his love and grace and mercy, unlike any of the other religions that I've come to cross. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Justin, how would you like to respond to this question? 1 minute.
I think it's quite convenient that he would say something like that, considering that the success of Christianity is largely owed to Constantine's acceptance of it in the 3rd century Roman Empire, and then its eventual expansion, and then the eventual wars against the Cathars and other heretic religions. just like any other religion, it profligated itself through institutions. In fact, in the last days of the Roman Empire, Christianity actually was more institutionalized and successful in spite of the Roman Empire. And that's why Constantine would eventually solidify it, because he knew of its institutional dominance. And if you need any other evidence for that, look at the Vatican. I mean, it's this huge place. I mean, Jesus was kind of meek and mild and poor. You'd think he'd live out in the barracks somewhere outside of, Vatican City. But you look at this, it is a religious institution.
10 seconds.
Now, personal revelation is a completely different thing, but I do think that that did play a role in the expansion of Christianity.
Okay, thank you. The next question will be for Justin.
I will form my question under the assumption that there is no man that has ever walked or will walk this earth that is morally pure. With that being said, how could one possibly validate morality based off the opinions and quotations of those whose motives are skewed? Morality cannot be formed without giving a name to a being that is pure, so in that comparison could be formed. And to a person of Christian faith, that is God's Son, Jesus Christ. To put it blatantly, the argument of morality could not be discussed without the acknowledgement of God, so your entire rebuttal collapses on itself. Because unless you are arguing against air this entire time, God does exist and is a very real thing that touches the lives of people every day.
Is this a question or is this a statement?
The question is, how could you argue
Okay.
the morality without acknowledging
Okay.
God?
Thank you.
Now, see, that was a very fast C-SPAN call. That was good. Okay, thank you. What was your name?
Talia.
Very nice to meet you. To answer your question, for me, I look at it in a couple different ways. So I look at it in two particular ways. Two philosophers have a really big impact on how I view morality. One of them is John Rawls and the other is Peter Singer. John Rawls had this idea of something called the veil of ignorance. And I agree with you completely that nobody is morally pure at all. And what I think about what Rawls' experiment does is he creates this idea that's called the veil of ignorance. It's this idea that if we were going to form a perfect moral society, then we wouldn't do it in relationship to whether we were a man or a woman or black or white or gay or straight. What kind of society could we develop? So that's kind of one part of it. And so when people don't have the biases, you try to tease out as much bias as possible in trying to develop a perfect world. The other one is something I call the principle of interchangeable perspectives. So as I don't think morality kind of was bad and then it got better. I think of it as being sort of like it was kind of good and then it got a little better and then it got a little better and a little better. Not because the rules necessarily changed, but because we fixed errors in our thinking. We fixed the error in thinking that women were subservient to men. We fixed the error in our thinking that African Americans or any people minority or even, of course, white people could be enslaved by each other. And so as that expansion increases, it is one that is interrelated to a physical world and a physical universe and how we interact with one another. I think that it's important also to note that within that principle of interchangeable perspectives, you eventually get to something like the women's rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, and then more importantly, the last one sort of in the discussion of rights movements is the animal rights movement. Now, I eat meat, I love meat, but I hope to someday not eat meat because I understand the moral argument for why if I change out my position with an animal, it's not terribly good for me. So great question, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Could you repeat the question, please? I'm sorry.
The entire thing or just the question?
Just the question part, yeah.
So I formed the question with the assumption that no man is pure. Mm-hmm. So how could you validate morality based off of man's quotes? And I'm basically saying you have to form a God to compare anything because that's the only way you could compare something pure with unjustness.
Okay, good question. So when we think of morality, I mean, there's even, Plato. Plato had the concept of Plato's form where you could idealize a perfect circle. You could idealize a perfect square. And this was in kind of an abstract realm. But see, it has no personality, okay? An abstract realm doesn't have moral oughtness. It doesn't have moral obligation, okay? So when you think of ontology, the ontology is, or how can you conceive of a being? Where does this morality come from? Well, if there's this idea of a perfect circle, who's abstract, but wouldn't it be greater to conceive of a God who was perfect in his being, in his character? So a being in which flows the source of all things, like moral goodness and moral rightness. And then if you think of a God,
10 seconds.
would be a God of justice and a God of love. So Plato's form, but except personality, it being God, would be the way I would answer that.
Okay.
That was a good first start. That was a good start.
Yes, very good first round of questions.
I thought we were going to get some
So-
softball questions. You guys are smart.
Great first start. Good crowd.
Okay, so a question for Chad. Next question, please.
Yes, Chad. I'm going to assume that you believe that the Bible is a moral guidebook. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Then my question is this. If Christians believe that the Bible is a moral guidebook, then shouldn't we be reading it in its original languages?
Is that the question you're asking?
Well, yes, because you were
Okay.
talking about interpretation and you were
Yes.
talking about exaggeration rhetoric and the
Yep.
context is everything. So
Okay.
should we be reading
Is
translations?
that your final question, or do
Yes.
you want me to say yes or no and then?
Yeah,
and
no,
then-
no, that's my final
Okay.
question.
Yes, okay. So,
Why?
what's that? And why? Okay, very good question. So the idea is, should we learn the Hebrew or the Greek in terms of the Old Testament, the New Testament, because they're written in the original language? Language changes over time, okay? But the intention of the meaning doesn't change, okay? So you might have something like, it was cold outside, and then you say it is cool, or that is cool. Well, that's two different words that are totally different, and so we see that words change over time. But if you read it in the context, it's cold outside, you still get the intended meaning of that text. If I say you're a cool person, well, the meaning of that cool is in its interpretation. So when you look at the original language, you can interpret based on all sorts of things. They call it the hermeneutical principle. The hermeneutical principle shows how you can discern what has been written in the original and what has not. So they call it when it was canonized. All right, so the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, you see that on CNN all the time. But they have to go through a certain process. One is called pseudepigrapha, which is false writings. So the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas were considered to be taken 4 or 5 centuries after the New Testament was written. So they can discard that because Gnosticism at the time, the idea of Gnosticism started to envelop itself into certain religious texts that were what we would call apocryphal. So when you think of language and you think of the meaning of the text, I think those are the crucial things in terms of learning the Hebrew and learning the Greek. But the last point I want to make is it's not this that God all of a
10
sudden
seconds.
brought it down to us in some language like it did in Islam. They believe that you have to know the Arabic. We're saying that it's good because actually as time changes, people will be able to understand the meaning. So the English text changes. You have to change it based on the culture.
Okay. Thank you.
So that's why God does it that way.
Justin?
I think I thought it's really interesting when he was talking about like discussions of words. It always reminds me of Back to the Future, where Marty McFly constantly says, "Man, that's heavy, Doc. That's heavy, Doc." And Doc goes, "What? Why is it heavy? Have the physical properties have changed in the future?" Like, I always think of that. Anyway, in response of his question, I would say, yeah, I think we should understand the original intentions of the original Aramaic and Greek, and then in the relationship to not only some of the earlier Latin translations of the Bible, but of course the 1611 translation of the King James Bible, and then other translations. But what I would say for that is, would I use it as like sort of a guide for morality? Not explicitly, no. But I do think of in classes of comparative religion or ethics, I do think that there is a place for religious studies, and more importantly, understanding the original texts and the discrepancies and the contextual nature of them. So that's kind of where I'm at on that. But in terms of it guiding my morality, no.
Okay. Thank you. We'll go to the next question for Justin. 2 minutes.
I got a question. How do you know there's no God that we could not be like if we were created by God?
Sure, that's a great question. So,
and also, if there was no God, then how have we been created?
Sure. Okay, great questions. So I'm what's called an agnostic atheist. So I take what's called the weak position philosophically, which is the idea that I don't, when someone claims there's a God, that's called the burden of proof. And all I'm saying is that the burden of proof is on the person making the claim. Like, I'm not claiming there is no God. All I'm claiming is that there is no evidence that I see that conclusively, for me, proves that there's a God. So it's kind of like thinking about it as like you have guilty and then you have not guilty. It's not like you have guilty and innocent. So you have guilty and not guilty. Think of atheism, at least for me, as sort of not guilty rather than saying innocent. Now, the belief that there is no God, like period, that's actually called anti-theism. And there are philosophical arguments for it. If you're interested in learning a little bit about that, I would recommend reading God, the Failed Hypothesis by Victor Stenger. But if, in terms of what I actually believe, I'm what's called an agnostic atheist. The burden of proof is on the theist making the claim and not me. In terms of why is there something from nothing, I don't know. I have no idea. Do I know what happened before the Big Bang? Absolutely not. And the argument that I would make is that this burden of proof is on those making the claim. I'm not trying to claim anything more than I can actually substantiate with evidence. So what I can say is that for like, did something come from nothing? Was there something for the Big Bang? I don't know, but let's go find out because that'd be really cool. So great questions, thank you.
Okay. Please go ahead.
So A.J. Ayer was an atheist, and he had an idea called logical positivism, where he basically said that the only thing he can believe is that which is empirical. But yet that statement itself is not empirically valid. Okay, so when you make a statement like that, it becomes self-contradictory. People say that you have to show evidence for God, if God had to show himself personally here tonight. But see, God is transcendent. He's above and beyond nature. But here's the thing. He's also immanent, and I'll explain that. In Jesus Christ, Jesus was the incarnation. He actually literally became a man. So the other religions don't have this concept, and we're saying that Jesus spoke to us. He lived on this earth. He revealed himself. So we know there's a God based on that. But also, when people say you have to have empirical evidence, I would say it's self-evident. There's always what we call axiomatic principles where you can't continue past to regress all the way. It's impossible. So it's just self-evident. God exists is what I would say.
Thank you. It would be Chad's turn to receive a question.
Hey, Chad, how's it going?
Hey, how are you, sir?
Treat to hear you speak today. My question concerns your argumentation as regards logic and validation. Considering that you have not substantiated the premise of a supernatural reality, considering that you have not substantiated the premise of supernatural beings as a part of that reality, or the premise that supernatural beings interact with the natural reality, or the premise that one supernatural being is the cause of morality over other supernatural beings, how is anyone to take this argumentation seriously?
Okay. So like I said earlier, when you think of supernatural beings, supernaturalism, the cause of morality, we're talking about a world that even atheists would say they're moral realists. They say that mental properties and physical properties, mental properties can't be shown. You can't, it's the is-ought distinction and also in David Hume's, but when you think of our ideas of my thought that you can't read my thought right now, it's not in some physical realm. So you're saying that I have to have physical evidence to explain who God is, but I've shown you that objective morality, the only possible way that objective morality can happen is if there is a God who has the source of authority to make that claim of objectivity. Because if it's in human opinion, then it's relativistic. It can change over time. If it's objective, it can maintain itself, and it's perfect and it's good. The other idea you said, so you said supernatural beings, supernaturalism, cause of morality. How can I explain that beyond what I've explained? There's the cosmological argument. There's the teleological argument, the moral argument. I don't know what else you want, so sorry.
Okay.
That wasn't bad to do in 2 minutes. Well done. I guess my response to his question is kind of a response to the previous question about air and things like that. So the axioms work on his side, but they don't work on mine. If you follow his logic, which is this idea that when A.J. Ayer said that all evidence has to be proven empirically, but that in and of itself is contradictory, you could say the same thing about God. So that doesn't really necessarily, for me, doesn't really provide any more evidence for God than anything else. In terms of the other arguments for God, most religious people don't come to religion through the arguments for God. Most of them come to it through family or a sense of community or a sense of personal experiences. And then they sort of rationalize their beliefs later with different arguments, like the teleological argument and the cosmological argument and things like that. So I just kind of think that it's a bit of a wash, and we could certainly get into sort of the logical absolutes and all that good stuff, but we don't have time. So we'll move on to the next question.
The next question is for Justin.
My question builds on a little bit on what you were just talking about.
Sure.
How do you propose parents teach their children about morality without a religious framework?
Sure, that's an excellent question. Thank you. So she asked about children and relationship to a religious framework. I think the way to do it is to read as much on parenting as possible. There's a lot of great literature on parenting. There's a lot of great literature in psychology of children that you can relate to and try to learn from that. The other thing I would do is just do things with them. So for example, if they're out to dinner and they're being rowdy, there's sort of two options you can go. You can either go, stop being rowdy and you can get a treat, or, which is like the easy, convenient way of doing it, right? Or you can go, please don't be quiet, because what if you were the other people sitting over there and they had to hear you? That's what I'm talking about with the principle of interchangeable perspectives. It's kind of like the golden rule, right? You want to be treated, you want to treat others as if they would treat you. And so if you can instill those values in a way that's sort of in real time, where they can learn from that, then I think we can do a lot better with our children. And it also, I think kind of using this method also gets rid of a lot of authoritarian parenting, which is, I think, quite dangerous to kids. So I'll give my time.
Okay.
I would agree with Justin. Like I said in my opening statement, you do not have to believe in God to know morals. So because I believe that everyone's created in the image of God, I believe if that premise is true, then people can have the ability to know that, what's right from wrong. Now, when you apply that, when someone breaks the rules, you might teach them, don't do that because it's wrong, because if you do that, you'll go to jail. Or there'll be some kind of there'll be some problem with what you've done is morally wrong. If you do drugs, you shouldn't do that because that's going to minimize your human well-being. But see, beyond that, what I would say is that it's not just that fact, but that there is a God who keeps us accountable for that gives us moral obligation. And in a naturalistic worldview, the only thing we have is what society tells us. If, like I mentioned, if everything said the majority's opinion rules, well, do whatever you want.
Okay, the next question will be for Chad.
Yeah, if moral conclusions are not arrived at independent of God, then how can you say that, or by what objective standard are you claiming that God is, objectively moral?
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
If moral conclusions are not arrived at independent of God, in other words, you said they're hardwired into everyone. But if those moral conclusions are not arrived at independent of God, they're placed there by God, then what objective moral standard are you using to conclude that God is moral? How is he objectively moral?
Okay. So what I'm saying is that he is the source of morality. He is what is true and what is right and what is good. And I guess the analogy I would use is if I had a computer and I'm a computer engineer, I have to have the blueprints involved. I have to think about how am I going to create a concept? How am I going to make this computer work correctly? I'm going to give it input A, input B, or whatever the case may be. So when God created us, he already had his objective moral standard because it exists within himself. As I mentioned, the dilemma that was raised is if objectivity is independent of God, then you'd have to say that it doesn't exist in God. And if objective morality is if God says it's okay because it's okay, well, then his commands can be arbitrary. But what I'm saying is there's a third option. And the third option is that contrary to his arbitrary commands, he is goodness himself, and so that he can't do anything other than what he is. So he is good, he is love. So objective morality comes from that standard, and that standard is him. And that's all I guess what I have to say about it.
Okay. Justin, a response?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, this idea of God is love, God is peace, God is justice, this kind of stuff, is what Daniel Dennett, the philosopher and psychologist, calls a deepity. It sounds really profound, but it really doesn't actually say anything. It's kind of like when you get like a Hallmark greeting card and you see, and it's like something like, you are the wind beneath my wings. It's nice, but what in the world does that actually mean? It's kind of the same thing with God is love. I think we still haven't really gotten to the heart of this debate, which is this idea of you have to, one, I think really do define God's relationship to morality. If God is independently of the universe and his existence, it has no bearing on what happens in here, or the existence of the universe has no bearing on him, rather, then why does he care? And I think that that's an interesting point about why that issue is so important. And so, we need to look at facts, we need to look at understandings, we do not need to look at deepities.
Next question would be for Justin.
Okay, you said something a few minutes ago that raised a question in my mind. You said that yes, you do eat meat, but you were hoping someday not to eat meat because if the situation between you and the animal were changed, it wouldn't be good for you, and I agree it would not. My question that I thought of at that point then, do you believe that human beings have the same intrinsic value as other animals such as swine, cattle, so forth, or do human beings have a greater intrinsic value than these other animals? If you believe that the intrinsic value of human beings and other animals is the same, how do you justify the fact that you have up to this point at least been eating meat? And if you believe that the intrinsic value of human beings is greater than that of other animals, on what basis do you make that value judgment?
Sure, that's a great question. You kind of scooped me. I know I'm bad, I'm eating bacon. Anyway, I think a great person to look at in terms of understanding that is Peter Singer. Peter Singer is an environmental ethicist and specifically wrote a book about animal rights. And I think one of the things that he talks about is what I was talking about earlier about degrees, both degrees of freedom and then degrees of moral action. And so I would argue, yes, I think that I would agree with the latter part of your question. I do think humans intrinsically do have more value than animals do. I always kind of agree with magician Penn Jillette that I would kill every chimpanzee on Earth to save one junkie with AIDS. Because I do think that a human is more important. The reason I think that that's more important goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that we have more degrees of moral action and freedom, which therefore, to me, at least, signals that we have a more valuable sort of objective standard. Now, in an ideal world, we wouldn't eat meat, but the problem with that is we also have competing moral claims about people who are starving. We also have competing claims about economic interests, so people who raise cattle or things like that. So we always have, within our lives, moral dilemmas. And what I think I would say, and especially with this, is that yes, I do think humans are a little more important. Do I think that that means that animal rights are kind of a wash? No. I think that it's about understanding the degrees with which animals have rights and the degrees to which we give them rights in society. I hope that answers your question.
That's a very good question. There's a book, I don't remember who the author is, but he talks about the history of rape, and he's talking about a particular species group, and then he mentions male mallards. And male mallards, if you don't know what they do, they basically come together and they copulate with one another, but some of them rape. They rape the female. And so we don't put male mallards on trial and say, that's wrong of you to do that. We don't take lions who eat zebras and eat all sorts of animals and say lions are murdering. We say it's the natural way of how things work. Lions eat zebras. We're not going to put a lion on trial. Now, Peter Singer would say that it's speciesism, that if we think that we're intrinsically valuable, then it's not right for us to eat meat. We shouldn't, because that's actually murder. Yet it's self-evident that we look at it as a distinction from us and animals. Humans and animals are distinct because of that value part.
The next question for Chad.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I actually thought of this question when you mentioned brainwashing earlier in your talk. You both brought up excellent points about things that have occurred in the past, and taking into account that there was a lack of knowledge in the world at that time versus what we have now. Could you say that moral compasses could be fine-tuned through learning experiences with or without the presence of a deity, or with or without the presence of religious or non-religious doctrine?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Very good question. So when you're talking about how cultures, as they evolve or as they change over time, that maybe that they get better, or they learn that over time when their environment changes. Like, for example, we look in America, and it wasn't until, the 1930s or 40s when women had the right to vote. We think about racial discrimination that was going on. Well, as culture started to learn and started to grow in their understanding of morality, they did grow and understand what was right and what was wrong. So I think you could make the case that as time evolves in certain circumstances, we become moral in terms of, but here's the thing, we live in the backdrop of Christianity. We were founded as a Christian nation in the now people will argue the founding fathers were deists, or they'll argue, I'm arguing from a Puritanist reform position. They left England to come here for the ideals of the church. And as they had that morality code, that we see what we see today. Once God is out of the equation, go to North Korea. Go find out if God exists there, because that's all about a regime and tyranny. You look at other countries, and even Stalin and others had that kind of position. So we're in the backdrop of Christianity, and the reason why we say that things are wrong is because it's embedded in our culture. We can't even escape it. Even atheists who deny God, they can't help but to be in this and living in this culture. My grandmother-in-law lived during the time of Stalin, and there was, in Ukraine and other countries, they don't abide by, they pay judges. They pay judges. There's no moral code going on there. So even in contemporary times, people are still evil. And I know he might have some statistics, but I found the United Nations, every century has actually gotten worse in terms of conflict. And I have that statistic if we need to go into that. So thank you.
All right, the first thing I'll talk about is, so you brought up North Korea. You could also go to Finland. You could also go to Denmark. You could also go to the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, France, Germany. Most of Europe is actually fairly secular. They have state religions, but they have state religions like we have, like bowling leagues, where they just sort of pay, but then they don't go, or it's like a gym membership. They don't really care. And they're pretty largely non-religious. That doesn't necessarily mean atheistic, but non-religious. And they have some of the highest rates of education, some of the highest rates of literacy. In fact, Iceland, which is a largely atheistic country, has the largest amount of books published per person in the world. Almost everybody there has written a book, which is kind of cool. And so when you think about that, in terms of violence, the one book I will definitely refer to you to is a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is by Steven Pinker, where he actually argues something quite different from what Chad just said, which is that we are actually living in the most peaceful time in the history of the human race. And that's kind of the argument that he makes.
Okay. Next question would be for Justin.
Justin, thanks for being here.
Thank you for coming.
I know this debate was supposed to be about where does God lie in morality, or what is his position in morality. But in your first rebuttal against Chad, you made a statement that we can't really argue morality unless we make a claim for the existence of God. And then it was brought up in one of the questions here.
Sure.
Your response to that question was, I don't know how everything came to begin, but let's go find out. That would be pretty cool. Those were your words. So my question lies is, if we have an acceptable answer already, why is that answer not good enough?
It's a great question. So why is it not good enough? Because I honestly, I'll go back to what I said earlier, because I just don't think it stands the burden of proof. And to be honest with you, I mean, we have competing religions all over the world. And not only that, but then we also have competing political and economic philosophies. I don't think there is like one like set answer. Does that mean we can't be objective? No. We can have objective rules based on the interactions with one another. It's kind of like a game. You would imagine it like a game where we develop the rules based on shared universal principles and then apply those rules to actions. We do the same thing with morality. So in a sense, morality belongs to all of us and none of us at the same time. I know that kind of sounds kind of weird, but I think it's a sort of a bottom-up thing, whereas religious morality is sort of a top-down. And then in reference to the I don't know question, I think questions of consciousness, the beginning of the universe before the Big Bang, I just don't know. But the skeptic's answer is not, I don't know, therefore it's whatever thing I like to believe. It is, I don't know, but let's investigate it.
You said, I don't know, but let's investigate it. What will happen is the atheists will say that we put this kind of God of the gaps, that if we can't figure it out, then we just say God did it. But see, in cosmology, they do the same thing. It's called, in terms of how they say the universe came into being, and that universe came from another universe, and that universe came ad infinitum all the way to what? You can't explain physical material substance from nothing. From nothing, nothing comes. And there's a book out there that talks about how he attempts to say that the universe could have come out of nothing. But see, nothing is still something. It's still something. And so what I would say is evidence is definitely there if you explore it. Copernicus and many of the astronomers, they did their duties because they believed that there was a God. They believed that there was rationality in the idea that there's truth. I mean, even Darwin said, if we're just but apes, how can we even trust ourselves? Well, we can trust ourselves because we have an intelligent creator.
Okay. That brings us right to 9 o'clock, so I would invite the remaining questioners to speak with the debaters later. Hold on to your questions. Debaters, if you would have a seat with me, and we'll wrap this up. I have been also given the privilege of making a brief statement and kind of encouraging everyone to think carefully about what they heard and what to do from here. And I think that as I have listened to this debate and listened to the questions and thought through this, the thing that comes to my mind as a psychologist is a phenomenon called confirmation bias. And if you've not heard this term before, this is the phenomenon that says that each of us as a human being with a human mind has a tendency to want to feel correct. And when we have formed an opinion about something, we have a tendency to listen more carefully and more attentively and with a greater sense of receptiveness to arguments that we already agree with, and to tend to close ourselves off to arguments that we don't already agree with. And so I will challenge you as audience members and debaters to leave this room trying to think about what was the best possible argument that the person you disagreed with offered, and to actually think carefully about that particular argument. Maybe you end up not agreeing with it, maybe it doesn't change anything, but at least don't get captured by only listening to your own mind and your own opinions, because this is an institution of higher education. We are here to listen to each other and to really think about what other people offer. And so I hope that this event has stimulated that kind of spirit in you as it has in me. So I'll just ask us to applaud the debaters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope everyone has an excellent night. Thank you very much.